Well, I think there's little doubt that this is primarily, though not wholly, a Brexit election. It now seems to be pretty clear, certainly so far in the first 2 weeks of the campaign, that around 80% of Leave voters are minded to vote for either the Conservatives or the Brexit Party, and that's well up on the 2/3 or so who voted for either the Conservatives or UKIP back in 2017. And on the other side of the argument, around 80% of those who voted Remain are saying that they're going to vote for one of the parties that's in favour of holding a second referendum. And that figure is also up to a degree on 2017. Now, of course, on the Remain side at least, most voters will have a choice as to which pro-second EU referendum parties to vote for. So even if you are also concerned about other issues, you can, as it were, potentially at least, vote both on the basis of Brexit and also on other issues. So I think it's sometimes a mistake to suggest, is this election about Brexit or is it about domestic issues? It's perfectly possible for it to be about both, because there's more than one Remain option on everybody's ballot paper, and for many people there'll be also more than one Leave option as well. So therefore, other considerations at that point can kick in. Well, the shadow that hangs over this election, of course, is what happened in 2017, when even at this point, the Conservative lead in the polls was bigger than the 12 or 13-point lead that they enjoy at the moment. A lead fabricated or created largely by squeezing the Brexit Party vote in a not dissimilar fashion to the way in which the UKIP vote was squeezed in the early phase of the 2017 election, but then thereafter it all turned pear-shaped for the Conservatives as the Labour Party gradually improved. I think one has to say, however, there are a number of differences from the position in 2017. The first is that the Labour Party's principal problem this time, although it's not absence of problem, but its principal problem is not losing votes to the Conservatives, it's losing votes to the Liberal Democrats. It has, first of all, to try to squeeze the Liberal Democrat vote amongst Remainers. It's had some success so far, but frankly, for every step that the Labour Party has achieved in getting slightly further ahead amongst Remain voters, the Conservatives have taken equally sized steps in squeezing the Brexit Party vote amongst Leavers. So to that extent, at least, Labour's net position has not improved. The second thing, of course, we have to bear in mind is that in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn's great advantage was that he was a much more adept, a much more comfortable campaigner than was Theresa May. And in a sense, he had the field of charisma to himself. This time, however, he faces Boris Johnson, who potentially on occasion looks fragile in public, but certainly is a much more formidable public speaker than is Theresa May. One assumes also that, unlike in 2017, the Conservative Party is ready for an election. One of the problems in 2017, they weren't. And of course, meanwhile, Jeremy Corbyn has to deal with Nigel Farage, another highly charismatic politician, and Joe Swinson is certainly better than the hapless Tim Farron of 2 years ago. So the competition is greater. And the other thing, of course, which is true, is that back in 2017, essentially the election started, people say, oh, actually, maybe Jeremy Corbyn isn't quite so bad as I thought. The trouble is, in the 2 years since then, pretty much everybody who came to that view during the election have changed their mind again, back to, well, hang on, I'm not really quite very good at all. Persuading them a second time that actually maybe he's not so bad after all might be rather more difficult than it was 2 years ago. Well, the honest answer to the question about how important TV debates is that sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. And even if they are for a while, we don't necessarily know how long the impact will last. Clearly in 2010, which was the first time when we had leaders' debates, and we had three really big leaders' debates with a big audience. Nick Clegg, the then Liberal Democrat leader, shot up in popularity. The Liberal Democrats suddenly went ahead in the polls, but by the time we got to polling day, it had all gone again. Neither 2015 nor 2017 was graced with anything like the same kind of event. Indeed, in 2017, Theresa May refused to take part in any leader debates. This time around, the answer to it is, we don't know. So maybe it will, maybe it won't. Certainly, I think Jeremy Corbyn needed to, given that he is indeed starting off this election even slightly less popular than he was 2 years ago. And given that it looks as though one of Labour's fundamental problems is persuading voters on virtually any issue, even the health service, that they're actually capable of providing the country with effective government. Jeremy Corbyn, in a sense, needs to look and sound prime ministerial, and perhaps more prime ministerial than Boris Johnson. That's going to be quite a considerable challenge for him, but that probably is the task that faces him. Well, it's always a perennial question that people ask in election. Well, yeah, but what about the don't knows? Might they change things? So, indeed, I did decide over last week, let's just take a look. 2 points. First is the level of don't knows, which is around between 11 and 17% in the polls, is more or less exactly the same level as it was at the last election. So there's no particular reason to believe that the don't knows are going to have any more impact than they had 2 years ago. They're much more likely to be women, but that's always the case. And the fact that they are women might be slightly to Labour's advantage, because certainly the Conservative lead amongst men is rather greater than it is amongst women. So if the women who have yet to make up their minds simply do so in the same way as those women who already expressed a view to polls, the electoral lead should narrow a little. And indeed, more broadly, the don't knows are rather more common amongst those who voted Labour in 2017, and maybe in the end they'll end up going to the Labour Party. But to be honest, these are marginal effects. In the end, the Labour Party is going to have to persuade people to change their minds. Now, around a third of people, depending on how you ask the question, indicate that they might be willing to change their mind, but it isn't going to be a case of mobilising the don't knows and the undecided. It is, as frankly was the case in 2017, a question of persuading people to change their minds. Well, all predictions at this stage of election have to be heavily caveated, because, of course, nobody knows what the next 4 weeks are going to bring. But certainly, insofar as the Conservatives have around a 12 or 13-point lead in the polls, which, if realised in the ballot box, certainly should be sufficient to win an overall majority, even though some of that lead might now be simply the consequence of the Brexit Party not standing in seats that the Conservatives are going to win anyway. But that would, if it goes through to December the 12th, should be sufficient. And given that so far there's no sign of the Labour Party making serious progress in eroding the Conservative lead, that looks good for the Conservatives. So I think at this point one would have to say 2-1 on that the Conservatives win, about a 66% chance. But they're still not that so far ahead of the point at which we, in terms of the National League, where we might begin to say, you know what, actually, maybe there'll be a hung parliament. And that depends on how you calculate, but that figure is somewhere between 5 and 8 percentage points. 13 clearly ahead, but if it falls down, not a great deal, we end up there. And certainly, the Labour Party's principal challenge is to see whether they can deny the Conservatives a majority. I think certainly the chances of the Labour Party itself getting the overall majority, particularly given the dire state of the party in Scotland, are frankly as close to zero as they come on these occasions. It is really a choice between a Conservative majority or a hung parliament. A hung parliament, of course, in which, however, most likely there will be a majority of MPs in favour of a second referendum.